What if you had to disappear to protect the honor of someone you love? What if your greatest proof of courage was silence, choosing to be forgotten, giving up everything, even your own name, so that others could live in peace? What would you do if the justice the world sees wasn't the same as the justice beating in your heart? Rawiri Tepuna never wanted applause, never wanted statues. He just wanted the pain he carried to die with him, so no one else would have to feel it. But truth, no matter how hard we try to bury it, always finds a way to bloom. And when it blooms, it forces us to face the most difficult question of all. What does it really mean to be a hero? She walked into that courtroom like any other day, ready to judge another routine case. But when the defendant's name was announced, she dropped her pen on the floor, a name forgotten by time, heavy with memories she'd tried to bury. The man before her was just another homeless person accused of breaking into a bakery. But what no one in that room knew was that he carried a secret capable of shaking the foundations of justice and the judge's very soul. What has this silent, invisible man been hiding for so many years? Why, even facing public humiliation, does he refuse to defend himself? And most shocking of all, what made the entire courtroom rise in absolute silence moments later? With tears in their eyes, you're about to hear a realistic, moving story that's impossible to forget. A story about sacrifice, love, and the price of protecting those we care about most. Because sometimes, a silent man's memory can shout louder than any judgment. If this story touched you in any way, like, share, and follow the channel so more people can discover stories that deserve to be remembered. Because sometimes, the memory of a silent man can speak louder than any verdict. The morning frost clung to the windows of Courtroom 2B at Wellington District Court like fingers refusing to let go. Inside, the air carried that familiar scent of old wood and worn leather that every courthouse seems to possess. A smell that speaks of countless stories, broken lives, and second chances that never came. Judge Talia Matene adjusted her black robes as she entered through the side door, her footsteps echoing in the nearly empty chamber. At 41, she had presided over hundreds of cases, from petty theft to domestic violence, and had learned to steel herself against the parade of human frailty that passed before her bench daily. But this morning felt different somehow, though she couldn't quite place why. In the defendant's corner sat a figure that seemed to blend into the shadows, a man wrapped in a threadbare military coat that had seen better decades. His gray hair pulled back in a loose knot that spoke of someone who still cared about dignity, despite his circumstances. His weathered hands, scarred and calloused, rested quietly in his lap, holding a small bundle that looked oddly out of place in the sterile courtroom environment. The clerk shuffled his papers with practiced efficiency. Your Honor, we have case number 2024 WDC 8847. The Crown versus... He paused, clearing his throat. Rawiri Tepuna, charged with unlawful entry and trespass. The pen in Judge Matene's hand fell. It struck the marble floor with a sharp crack that seemed to reverberate through the quiet chamber far longer than physics should have allowed. For 3 heartbeats, she counted them, felt them hammering against her ribs. She couldn't breathe. The name hung in the air like smoke from a fire she thought had been extinguished years ago. Rawiri Tepuna, the same name her brother Juani had written in letter after letter during his deployment to Afghanistan. The same name he'd whispered with tears in his eyes during their last phone call from Kabul, saying, "Tal, if something happens to me, remember this name, Rawiri Tepuna. He's the reason I'm still alive." She forced herself to look at the man properly now, searching his face for any resemblance to the ghost that had haunted her family's memories for 13 years. What she saw was a face carved by weather and hardship, eyes that held depths she couldn't fathom, and a stillness that suggested a man who had made peace with being forgotten by the world. Your Honor, the clerk's voice pulled her back to the present. Shall I proceed with the charges? Talia bent to retrieve her pen, using the moment to compose herself. When she straightened, her voice was steady, professional. Yes, please continue. According to the police report, the defendant had been found sleeping in the back room of a disused bakery on Courtenay Place at 5:23 a.m. the previous Tuesday. No resistance during arrest, no stolen goods, no damage to property beyond the broken lock on the rear door. Just a man seeking shelter from Wellington's winter chill in a building that had stood empty for 6 months. But something about his posture, the way he held himself with quiet dignity despite his circumstances, suggested there was far more to this story than a simple case of trespass. Mr. Tepuna, she addressed him directly. How do you plead to the charges? He lifted his head slightly, and for just a moment, barely a heartbeat, their eyes met. In that instant, she saw something that made her chest tighten. Recognition, not of her specifically, but of the situation itself, as if he had been waiting for this moment, expecting it even. "Guilty, Your Honor," he said quietly, his voice carrying the faintest trace of an accent that spoke of rural New Zealand, of places where Maori and English still dance together in everyday speech. The public defender assigned to his case, a weary-looking man named Elias Warepapa, leaned forward. "Your Honor, my client wishes to enter a plea of guilty, but I'd like to request consideration of his circumstances. Mr. Tipuna has no prior convictions for break and enter, and the property was unused. He was simply seeking shelter from the elements." Talia nodded, but her attention was drawn to the bundle in the defendant's lap. As she watched, he unconsciously tightened his grip on it, and she caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a child's blanket. Soft wool, with hand-stitched stars scattered across its surface. "Mr. Tipuna," she said, "is there anything you'd like to say before I consider sentencing?" He shook his head slowly. "No, Your Honor, I did what I did. I accept whatever comes next." But as he spoke, something in his tone, a resignation that went far deeper than this simple case warranted, made her realize that whatever judgment she passed today would be just one more weight added to a burden this man had been carrying for far too long. The morning light filtering through the tall windows caught the silver threads in his hair, and for a moment, she could almost see the young soldier her brother had described, the one who had pulled him from a burning vehicle, who had stayed with him through the longest night of his life, who had disappeared into the bureaucratic maze of military records and never emerged. "Court will adjourn for 15 minutes, she announced abruptly, her voice betraying none of the turmoil churning in her chest. "I need to review the sentencing guidelines." But as she retreated to her chambers, Talia knew she wasn't going to be reviewing any guidelines. She was going to be questioning everything she thought she knew about justice, about the past, and about the man sitting in her courtroom who might just be the ghost she'd been searching for without even knowing it. In the privacy of her chambers, Talia's hands trembled as she poured herself a glass of water she wouldn't drink. The police report lay spread before her on the mahogany desk, its clinical language failing to capture the humanity of what had actually happened that cold Tuesday morning. Subject discovered in rear storage area of premises at 47 Courtenay Place at approximately 05:23 hours. No signs of forced entry beyond damaged rear door lock. Subject offered no resistance during arrest. No stolen items found on person. No alcohol or substances detected. But what the report didn't mention, what Constable Jenny Morrison hadn't thought important enough to include, was the careful way the defendant had folded that peculiar blanket, as if it were made of spun gold rather than worn wool. It didn't mention how he'd thanked her politely when she'd arrested him, or how he'd asked if he could keep the blanket with him. What it certainly didn't capture was the story Jenny had heard 2 days later from Mrs. Chen, who owned the convenience store next to the bakery. She'd seen a young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, approach the homeless man near the dumpsters behind her shop. The child had been carrying something bundled in his arms, walking with the determined gait of someone on a mission. "My grandmother told me about you," the boy had whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "She said heroes shouldn't have to sleep on the ground." Before Rawiri could respond, the child had pressed the blanket into his weathered hands and disappeared into the maze of alleys that spider-webbed through Wellington's city center. The old man had called after him, but the boy was already gone, swallowed by shadows and the kind of childhood determination that brooks no argument. For 2 nights, Rawiri had slept rough with that blanket wrapped around his shoulders, feeling its warmth and wondering about the hands that had stitched those stars with such obvious care. He'd tried to find the boy, asking other rough sleepers if they'd seen a child matching his description. No one had. It was as if the encounter had been a dream, except for the very real weight of wool and kindness in his arms. On the 3rd night, when the southerly wind cut through Wellington streets like a blade fresh from the Antarctic, Rawiri had made the decision that led him to courtroom 2B. The bakery's rear door had been easy enough to force. The lock was old, corroded by sea air and neglect. Inside, the industrial oven still held a ghost of warmth from their working days, and for the first time in weeks, he'd slept without shivering. Back in the courtroom, the session had resumed with prosecutor Amanda Ellis outlining the Crown's case with efficient precision. She painted a picture of repeat offending, not because Rawiri had done this before, but because she argued that allowing such behavior would encourage others in similar circumstances. "Your Honor," she concluded, While we acknowledge the defendant's difficult circumstances, we cannot allow Wellington's abandoned buildings to become unofficial shelters. The law must be applied consistently, regardless of the sympathetic nature of individual cases. Elias Huerpapa rose to respond, but as he began to speak, something unexpected happened. Judge Mateen's composure cracked just enough for those who knew how to look to notice. When Elias mentioned his client's full name, Rawiri Tepuna has served this country with distinction. Her pen slipped slightly in her fingers, leaving an ink blot on her notes that she tried unsuccessfully to hide. Elias caught it. In his 8 years as a public defender, he'd learned to read judges the way sailors read weather patterns. And something in Judge Mateen's reaction told him there was more to this case than a simple trespass charge. "Your Honor," he continued carefully, "I'd like to request a brief recess to gather additional character references for my client. Given his military service, there may be relevant factors that could influence sentencing. It was a fishing expedition, and they all knew it." But Judge Mateen nodded, perhaps too quickly. "Granted. We'll reconvene tomorrow at 10 a.m. As the courtroom began to empty, Rawiri remained seated, still clutching that star-covered blanket. Elias approached him cautiously, noting how the older man's eyes never quite met his. "Mr. Tepuna, is there anything you can tell me about your military service? Anything that might help your case?" For a long moment, Rawiri was silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Some things are better left buried, son. Sometimes the only way to protect the people you love is to let them forget you ever existed." Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with Wellington's winter wind. "What do you mean?" But Rawiri had already stood, moving towards the door with the slow, measured pace of a man carrying invisible weights. At the threshold, he paused without turning around. "Tell me, Mr. Huerpapa," he said quietly, "do you have family?" "Yes, sir. A wife and daughter." "Then you understand. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give the people you love is your absence." As Rawiri disappeared into the corridor, Elias was left with more questions than answers, and the growing certainty that tomorrow's hearing would be about far more than a broken lock and a night's shelter. In her chambers, Judge Talia Mateen sat alone with her memories and a name that refused to stop echoing in her mind. Outside her window, Wellington Harbor stretched towards the horizon, gray and endless as the secrets people carry in their hearts. She reached for her phone, then stopped. The call she wanted to make couldn't be made. Not anymore. Hawani had been gone for 3 years now. His own demons finally claiming a victory that the war never could. But in a box in her mother's attic, she knew, were letters that might hold answers to questions she was only now learning to ask. And somewhere in this city of wind and rain, a man who might have been her brother's salvation was preparing to spend another night in a cold cell, still holding tight to a blanket stitched with stars by hands that had recognized a hero when the rest of the world had chosen to look away. Sleep had abandoned Talia completely. She lay in her bed until 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling where shadows danced like ghosts of conversations she'd never had. Finally, she gave up the pretense and drove through Wellington's empty streets to her mother's house in Karori, using her spare key to slip inside without waking anyone. The attic ladder creaked under her weight as she climbed into the dusty darkness above. Her phone's torch beam cut through the gloom, illuminating boxes that held the archaeology of her family's life. Christmas decorations, school reports, photo albums with corners curling like dried leaves. And there, in the far corner, the box she'd been avoiding for 3 years. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid. Inside, Hawani's army uniform lay folded with military precision, still carrying the faint scent of the aftershave he'd worn. Beneath it, bundles of letters tied with string, medals in felt-lined cases, and photographs of her brother with his unit. Young men trying to look tough while their eyes betrayed how far they were from home. But it was the VHS tape at the bottom that made her breath catch. Written on the label in Hawani's careful handwriting, Day 204, Fob Coast. For Tal, if I don't make it home. She'd never known this tape existed. In the 3 years since his death, a car accident that everyone knew was no accident, not with the amount of alcohol in his system and the deliberate way he'd aimed for that concrete barrier, she'd thought she'd found everything he'd left behind. The old television in the attic still had a VHS player attached. It took several attempts to get it working, the machine protesting with mechanical groans that seemed loud as gunshots in the pre-dawn silence. When the screen finally flickered to life, she saw her brother's face. Younger but already bearing the weight that would eventually crush him, he was sitting in what looked like a military barracks, sand visible through a window behind him. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his uniform wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. Tal, his voice came through the static, and she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. If you're watching this, then I didn't make it back to tell you this myself. He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture she remembered from childhood when he was trying not to cry. I've been thinking about how to explain this, and I keep coming back to one thing. I owe you the truth. About why I might not come home. About why, if something happens to me, it won't be the war that killed me. It'll be the guilt. The camera shook slightly, as if he'd bumped the tripod. When it steadied, tears were visible on his cheeks. There's a man here, Tal. Rawiri Tapuna, and if you ever hear that name, you need to stop everything and listen, because that man is the reason I'm still breathing. He's the reason I got to see another sunrise after what happened in Nuruzgan province. Talia found herself leaning forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. We were on patrol, just a routine check of the village perimeter. I was point man that day, and I made a mistake. A terrible, stupid mistake that got 3 civilians killed and nearly took out half our unit. Rawiri could have let me burn for it. Should have, according to every rule in the book. Instead, Wani's voice broke completely then. For nearly a minute, the tape showed him struggling to compose himself while she watched, tears streaming down her own face 13 years later. He took the blame, Tal. All of it. Said it was his call, his responsibility as senior NCO. But it wasn't. It was mine. And when the investigation started, when they were looking for someone to court-martial, he stepped forward and accepted full responsibility for a decision that was going to haunt me for the rest of my life. The camera angle shifted as he adjusted it, bringing his face closer to the lens. His eyes were red-rimmed but determined. They stripped him of his rank, took away his pension, made him disappear from the official record so completely that it's like he never existed. And he let them do it. For me. For a 22-year-old kid who was too proud to admit his mistake cost innocent people their lives. Talia's hands were pressed against her mouth now, muffling the sobs that she couldn't contain. I tried to find him after we got back, tried to set the record straight, but he'd vanished. And every time I asked about him, I got the same response. There's no record of anyone by that name serving in that capacity, like he was a ghost, like he never existed. The tape hissed with static for a moment before Hawani's voice returned, quieter now, resigned. I can't live with this anymore, Tal. The nightmares, the guilt, knowing that somewhere out there is a man who sacrificed everything to save my reputation, my future, my family's honor, and I can't even find him to say thank you. He looked directly into the camera then, and it felt like he was looking at her across time and death. If something happens to me, if I don't make it home, and if by some miracle you ever encounter Rawiri Tapuna, tell him Hawani Matene never forgot. Tell him that every good thing I did after that day, every life I saved, every moment of happiness I managed to find, it was because of his sacrifice. Tell him. The tape cut off abruptly, leaving Talia staring at a blue screen while the player hummed quietly in the darkness. She sat there for nearly an hour, processing what she'd heard, understanding finally why her brother had struggled so much after coming home. The drinking, the nightmares, the way he'd sometimes stare into space as if seeing ghosts. It all made sense now. When she finally climbed down from the attic, dawn was breaking over Wellington Harbor. She had court in 4 hours, and a decision to make that would define not just her career, but her understanding of justice itself. In her handbag, she carried a USB drive with the tape's contents transferred to digital format, evidence that could change everything, or destroy it completely. Judge Mateen arrived at court that morning with shadows under her eyes and a determination that burned like a fever. She'd spent the hour before the hearing making phone calls that tested the limits of her judicial authority, calling in favors from law school contacts, and leveraging her reputation to access records that most civilians would never see. David Kumar, her former classmate who now worked in the Defense Ministry's legal department, had been reluctant at first. Tal, you know I can't just hand over classified military files, even to a sitting judge. I'm not asking for classified files, she'd replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her chest. I'm asking you to confirm whether a man named Rawiri Tapuna served with the NZDF in Afghanistan between 2009 and 2011. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for her to wonder if he'd hung up. When David finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. What's your interest in this particular individual? He's standing trial in my courtroom today for trespassing. I want to understand his background before I sentence him. Another pause. Then, I'll see what I can find. But Tal, be careful. Some stories are classified for good reasons. An hour later, her secure email had pinged with a message containing 3 attachments. The first was an official service record showing Rawiri Tipuna as having served with distinction as a senior NCO with the 21 Battalion Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment from 2008 to 2011. The second was a commendation for bravery during Operation Watea, citing his actions in saving multiple civilian and military personnel during an insurgent attack on a village in Uruzgan province. The third document made her hands shake so violently she had to set down her coffee cup. It was a disciplinary report, heavily redacted, but the key details were visible. Senior NCO Tipuna had been found responsible for a tactical decision that resulted in civilian casualties during a patrol operation. The report recommended court-martial proceedings and immediate discharge without honors, but there was a handwritten note in the margin. Barely legible. Subject has requested to accept full responsibility to protect junior personnel involved. Recommend administrative discharge with pension forfeiture in lieu of criminal proceedings. The date on the report matched exactly with the incident her brother had described on the tape. When court convened at 10 a.m., Talia felt as though she were watching someone else's life unfold. Rawiri sat in the same position as yesterday, that peculiar blanket folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the courtroom walls. "Before we proceed with sentencing," she announced, her voice carrying more authority than she felt, "I'm ordering a 48-hour adjournment to allow for additional investigation into matters of military service that may be relevant to this case." Prosecutor Ellis looked puzzled. "Your Honor, this is a simple trespass case. I'm not sure what military service has to do with—" "The court will determine relevance, Ms. Ellis." Talia's tone brooked no argument. "Mr. Warepapa, I'm also ordering that your client undergo a psychological evaluation to determine his fitness for standard sentencing procedures. It was an unusual request for such a minor charge, but it would give her the time she needed to verify what she'd learned and decide how to proceed." As the courtroom began to clear, she noticed that Rawiri hadn't moved. He sat perfectly still, that blanket clutched in weathered hands, his shoulders bearing the weight of invisible burdens. "Mr. Tipuna," she said quietly, approaching the defendant's table, "is there anything you'd like to tell me? Anything at all?" He looked up at her then, and for the first time she saw past the ravages of street living to the man beneath. His eyes were clear, intelligent, and infinitely sad. "There's nothing to tell, Your Honor," he said with quiet dignity. "I broke the law. I accept the consequences, even if those consequences are unjust." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Justice isn't always about what we deserve, Your Honor. Sometimes it's about what we can live with." That afternoon, Talia drove to the Department of Veterans Affairs in Petone. The woman behind the reception desk was polite but firm. Without proper authorization, she couldn't provide any information about individual veterans. "I understand your position," Talia replied, producing her judicial identification. "But I'm not asking for confidential information. I simply need to know whether Rawiri Tipuna is receiving any veterans' benefits." 20 minutes later, she had her answer. According to the official records, no one named Rawiri Tipuna was currently receiving any form of veterans' pension, medical support, or housing assistance. As far as the system was concerned, he didn't exist. But there was something else in the file that made her blood run cold. A handwritten note from 2011. Pension entitlement voluntarily transferred to family of deceased service member KIA Uruzgan province. Transfer authorized under Compassionate Grounds Provision 4.7.3. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, creating a picture so devastating that she had to sit in her car for 10 minutes before she felt steady enough to drive. Rawiri hadn't just taken the blame for her brother's mistake. He'd given up his pension, his only source of support in civilian life, to ensure that the family of someone who died in that incident would be taken care of. He'd made himself officially invisible, a ghost in the system, to protect both her brother's reputation and a dead soldier's legacy. That evening, she returned to the courthouse and sat alone in courtroom 2B, imagining how the next day would unfold. She could sentence Rawiri to time served and a small fine, let him disappear back into the streets and no one would ever know the truth of what he'd sacrificed. Or she could do something that would change everything. On her desk lay the USB drive containing her brother's confession, and beside it, The military records that proved every word of it. Evidence that could restore a good man's reputation and expose a system that had allowed injustice to masquerade as honor. But she also knew that revealing the truth would destroy her brother's memory, taint his service record, and break her mother's heart all over again. The choice between justice and mercy had never felt more impossible. Outside the courthouse windows, Wellington's lights twinkled like stars. And somewhere in those streets, a man who'd given up everything for the sake of others was spending another night in a cell, still protecting secrets that were slowly killing them all. When court reconvened, Courtroom 2B was no longer the quiet chamber it had been 2 days earlier. Word had somehow leaked about the homeless veteran case, and the public gallery held twice as many people as usual. Local journalists sat with notebooks ready, sensing a story worth telling, while several older men in RSA jackets had positioned themselves in the front rows. Veterans who'd heard whispers of something significant unfolding. Rawiri entered through the side door, flanked by 2 court officers, but his demeanor remained unchanged. The same quiet dignity, the same careful way of holding that star-covered blanket, the same refusal to make eye contact with anyone in the room. When Judge Mateen entered, she noticed how he straightened slightly, not in submission but in respect for the institution, even as it prepared to judge him. "Before we proceed," Talia announced, "I want to address some unusual circumstances that have come to my attention regarding this case." She'd spent the entire night deciding how to handle what she'd learned, and had finally settled on a course of action that felt both legally sound and morally necessary. "Mr. Tipuna, I've reviewed your military service record. You served with distinction in Afghanistan with the 2-1 Battalion Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment. Is that correct?" For the first time since the proceedings began, Rawiri looked directly at her. His eyes held a wariness that spoke of a man who'd learned not to trust official inquiries. "I served, Your Honor. That's all. According to the records, you received a commendation for bravery. You saved multiple lives during an insurgent attack in Uruzgan province. I did my job." The prosecutor, Amanda Ellis, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. This level of background investigation was highly unusual for a trespass case, and she could sense the proceedings moving into territory that hadn't been covered in her preparation. "Mr. Tipuna," Talia continued, "I'm also aware that your military service ended under complex circumstances. Would you care to elaborate?" The silence that followed was so complete that the courthouse ventilation system seemed deafeningly loud. Rawiri's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he remained silent. "Your Honor," Elias Werpapa interjected, "my client prefers not to discuss the details of his discharge." But before Talia could respond, something unexpected happened. An elderly woman in the gallery stood up abruptly, her voice cutting through the formal atmosphere like a blade. "That man saved my son." Every head in the courtroom turned toward the back rows where Morangi Fa'avai, a Samoan woman in her 70s, stood trembling with emotion. She wore her best dress, navy blue with a modest floral pattern, and her gray hair was pulled back in a traditional style that spoke of old-world dignity. "Mrs. Fa'avai," one of the court officers began, "you can't—" "No." Her voice carried the authority of a woman who'd raised 8 children and buried one. "I have been silent for 13 years. But I will not be silent anymore. Not when that man is being treated like a common criminal." Talia felt her heart racing. "Ma'am, this is highly irregular, but if you have relevant information about the defendant, I'll allow you to speak." Morangi stepped into the aisle, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "My son Sione served with that man in Afghanistan. Private Sione Fa'avai, 2-1 Battalion. And when the bombs went off in that village, when everything was fire and screaming and chaos, it was Rawiri Tipuna who pulled my boy from the wreckage." Tears streamed down her face as she continued, her accent thickening with emotion. "My son told me everything when he came home. How Sergeant Tipuna dragged him 200 meters with shrapnel in his own leg. How he went back for 2 other soldiers while the building was still burning. How he stayed with the wounded until the medics arrived." Rawiri had gone completely still, his face a mask of controlled emotion. "But there's more," Morangi continued, her voice growing stronger. "My son also told me what happened after. How someone made a mistake that killed 3 innocent people in that village. How a young soldier was going to be destroyed by it. And how Sergeant Tipuna stepped forward and said it was his fault, his decision, his responsibility." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but Talia's attention was fixed on Rawiri, who had finally looked up, not at the judge, but at the woman who was telling his story. He gave up everything, Morangi said, her voice breaking. His rank, his pension, his future, all to protect a boy who made one terrible mistake. And my son never forgave himself for staying silent. He carried that guilt until the day he died in that car accident 3 years ago. The last words hit Talia like a physical blow. Sione Favai. She'd heard that name before, in the veterans' records, in the compassionate transfer documents. Her brother hadn't been the only one carrying survivor's guilt. Your Honor, Morangi continued, I don't know what law this man is supposed to have broken, but I know this. He is not a criminal. He is a hero who was punished for having a conscience. As she sat down, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. Several of the veterans in the front rows had tears in their eyes, and Talia noticed that even some of the court staff were visibly moved. She looked at Rawiri, who had returned his gaze to that invisible point on the wall, but now she could see what she'd missed before. The slight tremor in his hands, the way his breathing had become careful and controlled, the enormous effort it was taking him to maintain his composure. Mr. Tepuna, she said quietly, would you like to respond to Mrs. Faavai's statement? He was quiet for so long that she wondered if he'd heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I did what needed to be done, Your Honor. I made choices I could live with. I don't require anything in return. But don't you think you deserve— No, the word came out sharp, final. I don't deserve anything except to be left in peace. It was then that Talia understood something crucial about the man before her. This wasn't about legal justice or military honor or even public recognition. This was about a man who had decided that his suffering was the price for other people's peace, and who was determined to pay that price in full, regardless of the cost to himself. Outside the courthouse, she could see news vans beginning to gather. The story was getting out whether Rawiri wanted it to or not, and somewhere in the Defense Ministry, phones were probably already ringing with questions about classified operations and uncomfortable truths. The hearing was no longer about a broken lock and a night's shelter. It had become something much larger, much more dangerous, and much more necessary than anyone had anticipated. And at the center of it all sat a man who still refused to ask for anything except the right to disappear. That night, Talia couldn't bear to return to her own flat. Instead, she drove to her mother's house in Karori, using her key to slip inside after her mother had gone to sleep. Back in the attic, surrounded by the ghosts of her family's past, she continued searching through Hawani's belongings with a desperation that bordered on obsession. It was nearly midnight when she found it. A sealed envelope tucked between the pages of her brother's copy of Fields of Fire, the war memoir he'd read obsessively after returning from deployment. The envelope was addressed in Hawani's careful handwriting. Rawiri Tepuna, CO21 Battalion RNZIR, but it had never been posted. The seal was still intact, the stamp never affixed. With trembling fingers, she opened it and unfolded 3 pages of her brother's handwriting, dated just 2 months before his death. Dear Rawiri, I don't know if this letter will ever reach you. I don't even know if you're still alive. The Defense Ministry claims they have no record of your current whereabouts, and every attempt I've made to locate you through official channels has hit a brick wall. It's as if you've been erased from existence, which I suppose was the point. I'm writing this anyway because I need you to know the truth. Not the truth that's in the official reports, not the truth that protected my career and my family's honor, but the real truth that's been eating me alive for 3 years. Talia's hands shook as she continued reading. You didn't make the call that day in Uruzgan province. I did. It was my decision to breach that compound without proper reconnaissance. My choice to ignore the intelligence about civilian presence in the target building. My order that led to the deaths of 3 innocent people, including 2 children. You could have let me burn for it. Should have, according to every rule of military justice. Instead, you stepped forward and claimed responsibility for a decision that was mine alone. You told the inquiry board that as senior NCO, you had approved my tactical assessment and that any failures were yours to bear. I was 22 years old, Rawiri, a kid playing soldier who thought he was invincible. You were 38 with 15 years of experience and a family back home depending on your pension. And yet when it came time to choose between destroying my future and sacrificing your own, you didn't hesitate. The next paragraph was written in shakier handwriting, as if Hawani had been crying while he wrote it. I let you do it. God help me. I stood there and watched them strip you of your rank, your pension, your entire military identity. and I said nothing. I told myself I was protecting the unit, protecting the mission, protecting everyone except the one person who actually deserved protection. The nightmares started before I even left Afghanistan. Not of the explosion, not of the bodies we pulled from the rubble, but of the look in your eyes when you accepted responsibility for my failure. You looked relieved, as if you'd been waiting for an opportunity to sacrifice yourself for something worthwhile. I've spent 3 years trying to understand why you did it. The only conclusion I can reach is that you saw something in me, some potential, some worth, that I've never been able to see in myself. And that faith you had in me has become the heaviest burden I've ever carried. Talia had to stop reading for several minutes. Through the attic window, she could see Wellington's lights twinkling in the distance, and somewhere out there, the man her brother had written about was spending another night in a cold cell. I need you to know that every good thing I've done since that day, every life I've helped save, every moment of peace I've managed to find, exists because of your sacrifice. You didn't just take the blame for my mistake. You gave me a second chance at being the soldier you believed I could become. But it's not enough. Nothing I do will ever be enough to balance the scales of what you gave up for me, and I can't live with that knowledge anymore. If you're reading this, it means someone found this letter after I'm gone. I hope that person understands that you are the most honorable man I've ever known, and that the world is a lesser place for having lost you to its bureaucracy and indifference. I'm sorry, Rawiri. I'm sorry for my mistake. Sorry for my cowardice, and sorry that I was never brave enough to set the record straight while I still could. Your debt is paid. Mine never will be. Juani Matene Talia sat in the dusty attic, holding her brother's final confession, and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of justice. All this time she'd thought Juani had died because of trauma from the war, but the truth was darker and more complex. He died because he couldn't live with the injustice he'd allowed to stand. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with winter rain drumming against the courthouse windows. The media presence had tripled overnight. News of the veterans' case had spread through social media and morning talk shows, transforming a simple trespass hearing into something approaching a public trial. When court convened, Talia entered with the letter in a sealed evidence bag and a decision that would define the rest of her career. Before we proceed with sentencing, she announced, I need to present new evidence that has come to my attention, evidence that fundamentally changes the nature of this case. She looked directly at Rawiri, who met her gaze for the first time since the proceedings began. In his eyes she saw not fear or hope, but a kind of resigned acceptance, as if he'd known this moment would come eventually. Mr. Tipuna, I'm going to read into the record a letter written by Lieutenant Juani Mateen of the 2-1 Battalion Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment. A letter that was never sent, but which contains information directly relevant to your military service record. As she began to read her brother's words aloud, she watched Rawiri's carefully constructed composure finally begin to crack. By the time she reached the confession about Uruzgan province, tears were streaming down his weathered cheeks. When she finished, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of rain against glass and the quiet sobbing of several people in the gallery. Mr. Tipuna, she said quietly, would you like to respond to Lieutenant Mateen's letter? For a long moment he sat motionless. Then slowly, he stood up and looked around the courtroom, at the journalists, the veterans, the court officials, all watching him with a mixture of awe and heartbreak. Your Honor, he said, his voice stronger than it had been throughout the entire proceeding. I would like to make a statement. The silence was absolute as every person in the room leaned forward to hear what this ghost of a man had finally decided to say. Rawiri stood slowly, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the defendant's table for support. The star-covered blanket fell to the floor, the first time he'd let it go since entering the courtroom 3 days earlier. When he spoke, his voice carried across the silent chamber with a clarity that seemed to surprise even him. Your Honor, for 13 years I have carried the weight of that day in Uruzgan province, not because of what I did, but because of what I allowed others to believe I had done. He paused, looking directly at the gallery where Morangi Faavai sat with tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Faavai, your son Sione was a good soldier. He saved my life twice before I ever had the chance to save his. The guilt he carried, it was never his burden to bear. He turned toward the bench where Talia sat frozen, her brother's letter still trembling in her hands. Lieutenant Mateen was barely more than a boy when he made that call. A split-second decision in the chaos of combat that went wrong in the worst possible way. But he was my responsibility. All those young soldiers were my responsibility, and when the investigation began, when I saw what it would do to him, to his family, to his future, I made a choice. The courtroom remained absolutely silent, as if everyone was afraid that any sound might break the spell of this long overdue confession. I didn't take the blame to be noble, Your Honor. I took it because I was already broken. My wife had left me 2 years earlier. My own children wouldn't speak to me because I'd chosen the army over family dinners and school plays. I had nothing left to lose except a pension and a reputation that had already cost me everything that mattered. His voice grew stronger, more resolute. But Juani, Lieutenant Mateen, had everything ahead of him. A family who loved him, a sister who looked up to him, a mother who prayed for him every night. I couldn't let one moment of bad judgment destroy all of that. Talia felt as though she couldn't breathe. The weight of understanding, of finally seeing the full picture of her brother's story, was crushing. After the discharge, I disappeared because that was part of the agreement. The Defense Ministry needed someone to blame, but they also needed to ensure that the real story never surfaced. So they made me vanish from the records, and I let them, because it meant that Juani could go home with his honor intact. He looked around the courtroom again, taking in the faces of the journalists, the veterans, the court officials who were all witnessing this moment. For 13 years, I lived rough because I believed that was my penance. I thought if I suffered enough, if I gave up enough, it might somehow balance the scales for those 3 civilians who died because of a mistake that should never have been mine to claim. The revelation that followed hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. But 3 months ago, I learned something that changed everything. I discovered that Lieutenant Mateen had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, and that according to those who knew him, he'd been struggling with guilt and trauma that led to his drinking, his isolation, and ultimately, his death. Talia's sob was audible across the entire courtroom. When I realized that my sacrifice, the thing I thought was protecting him, had actually contributed to his destruction, I understood that I had failed in the worst possible way. I hadn't saved him. I had just delayed his suffering and made it worse. Rawiri's voice broke then, 13 years of suppressed emotion finally breaking through the walls he'd built around his heart. The night I broke into that bakery, Your Honor, it wasn't just about escaping the cold. It was about finding a place warm enough to finally let go. I had decided that my story was over, that there was nothing left for me to protect or preserve. The elderly woman in the gallery, Morangi, stood up again, but this time she didn't speak. She simply walked down the aisle and wrapped her arms around the man who had saved her son, holding him as he finally allowed himself to grieve for all the losses his sacrifice had failed to prevent. But then, Rawiri continued through his tears, a little boy gave me a blanket, a child who said his grandmother had told him that heroes shouldn't sleep on the ground, and I realized that maybe there was still something worth preserving after all. He picked up the fallen blanket, holding it against his chest like a shield. I don't want medals, Your Honor. I don't want parades or newspaper articles or government apologies. I just want to know that the truth has finally been told, that Lieutenant Mateen's memory can be whole again, and that maybe somewhere the families of those civilians who died in Uruzgan province can know that their loved ones weren't forgotten, that their deaths mattered enough for someone to carry the weight of them for 13 years. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of people weeping throughout the gallery. Even some of the court officials were visibly moved, their professional composure cracking in the face of such raw, honest emotion. Judge Mateen looked around the courtroom, at the journalists frantically taking notes, at the veterans who had stood to attention without being asked, at the ordinary citizens who had witnessed something extraordinary. "Mr. Tepuna," she said, her voice barely steady, "this court finds you guilty of the charges as stated, but in light of the exceptional circumstances revealed today, and in recognition of your service to this country and the sacrifices you have made, I am sentencing you to time served and ordering that all fines be waived." She paused, looking directly into his eyes. "Furthermore, I am recommending that the Defense Ministry conduct a full review of your case with an eye toward restoring your service record and providing appropriate compensation for the injustices you have suffered." But even as she spoke the words, Talia knew that the real resolution of this case wouldn't happen in a courtroom or a government office. It would happen in the hearts of everyone who had heard this story and would carry it forward. A reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen in silence, performed by people the world chooses to forget. 3 weeks later, Rawiri Tepuna stood on a windswept hill in the Tararua Range, about an hour's drive from Wellington. The government had offered him a small flat in Petone, a restored pension, and even a formal ceremony at Parliament to present him with the New Zealand Gallantry Star that should have been his years earlier. He had accepted the flat and a modest pension, but declined everything else. "I don't need ceremonies," he told the defense minister's representative. "I just need to know that the record is straight," and it was. The official files had been corrected, Juani's service record cleared of any disciplinary action, and a quiet addendum added to the historical record, acknowledging the true circumstances of the Uruzgan province incident. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The hill where he now stood held special significance. It had been used as a training ground for New Zealand forces heading to Afghanistan, a place where young soldiers like Juani had learned to work as a team, to trust each other, to understand that their individual survival depended on their collective strength. In his hands, Rawiri held a small Pohutukawa sapling he'd bought from a native plant nursery. The Pohutukawa, New Zealand's Christmas tree, was known for its ability to grow in harsh conditions, clinging to cliff tops and rocky shores where other trees couldn't survive. It seemed appropriate. As he dug the hole with a small spade he'd brought in a backpack, Rawiri thought about the letter Judge Mateen had given him after the hearing. It was from the boy who had given him the blanket, a 9-year-old named James whose grandmother had indeed told him about the homeless man who was actually a war hero. The letter, written in careful, childish handwriting, said simply, "Dear Mr. Rawiri, Nana says you were sad because you thought you failed someone important, but you didn't fail. You loved them enough to hurt for them. That's what heroes do. P.S. I hope you like the blanket. Nana made it for my dad before he died, but I think you need it more." It was only then that Rawiri had understood the true gift he'd been given. The blanket hadn't been random kindness from a stranger. It had been a deliberate act of recognition from a family that understood loss, sacrifice, and the weight of carrying someone else's memory. He carefully placed the sapling in the ground, packing soil around its roots with the same precision he'd once used to field strip a rifle or tend to wounded soldiers. When it was secure, he reached into his pocket and withdrew the New Zealand Gallantry Star that had been quietly delivered to his flat the week before. Despite his refusal to attend any ceremony, using a piece of wire from his toolkit, he hung the medal from one of the sapling's delicate branches. Then, from a plastic sleeve, he took out a handwritten note he'd prepared and secured it to the small tree's trunk. "In memory of 3 civilians killed in Uruzgan Province, Afghanistan, 2011. And for all the soldiers who carry burdens that aren't theirs to bear. Sometimes the greatest victory is learning when to lay down your weapons." As he stepped back to survey his work, Rawiri felt something he hadn't experienced in 13 years. Peace. Not the peace of forgetting or denial, but the peace that comes from acceptance, of loss, of imperfection, of the complex weight of being human in an imperfect world. The wind picked up, causing the metal to turn slowly on its wire, catching the afternoon sunlight and sending small rainbows dancing across the grass. In the distance, Wellington Harbor stretched toward the horizon, and somewhere down there, life was continuing for all the people whose stories had intersected with his own. Judge Talia Mateen was back in her courtroom, but she'd had a small plaque installed on the wall, not naming Rawiri specifically, but acknowledging that sometimes justice required more than law could provide. Morangi Fa'avai had started a support group for families of veterans struggling with trauma, and the boy named James was learning from his grandmother that heroes come in many forms. The media attention had faded, as media attention always does, but the story had planted seeds in hearts and minds across New Zealand. Conversations were being had in RSA halls and veterans support centers, in parliament corridors and family dining rooms, about the hidden costs of service and the importance of ensuring that those who sacrifice for others aren't forgotten by the very society they protected. As the sun began to set behind the ranges, Rawiri made his way back down the hill to where his old car was parked. He would return to his modest flat, make himself a simple dinner, and spend the evening reading, something he'd rediscovered during his recovery from the media storm. But he would also return to this hill regularly, to tend the growing tree, and remember not just the weight of what he'd carried, but the relief of finally being able to set it down. 3 months later, when some of the soldiers from his old unit read about the case and tracked down the location, they found more than just a tree and a medal. They found a small garden that Rawiri had been quietly maintaining, native plants that attracted birds, a small bench made from recycled wood, and a growing collection of stones that visitors had left, each one representing a story, a memory, or a prayer. The tree was growing strong, its roots reaching deep into the soil while its branches stretched toward the sky. And hanging from those branches, alongside the original medal, were other tokens that people had brought. Dog tags from soldiers who wanted to be remembered, photographs of family members lost too soon, and small notes of gratitude from people who understood that sometimes the most important battles are fought in silence. On the day Judge Mateen finally visited the site, 6 months after the hearing that had changed everything, she found Rawiri there tending to the plants. They sat together on the bench in comfortable silence, watching the wind move through the grass and listening to the birds that had made their home in the growing tree. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked finally. "All those years of carrying a burden that wasn't yours?" Rawiri considered the question carefully before answering. "I used to think that regret was just another word for love with nowhere to go," he said. "But I've learned something these past months. Sometimes love needs to hurt for a while before it can heal, and sometimes the person you're really trying to save is yourself." As they sat together watching the sun set over the ranges, both of them understood that some stories don't end. They just transform into something larger, something that belongs not to the individuals who lived them, but to everyone who needs to believe that sacrifice has meaning, that love persists beyond death, and that heroes are often found in the most unexpected places. The tree continued to grow, its roots deep and its branches reaching always toward the light. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones history forgets to write about. Rawiri Tepuna's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. In a world obsessed with recognition and praise, what does it mean to sacrifice everything without asking for anything in return? What would you have done in that courtroom? Remained silent to protect others or spoken up to save yourself? Could you carry someone else's burden for 13 years, watching your own life crumble whilst preserving their legacy? These aren't just questions about Rawiri's choices. They're questions about the kind of person you choose to be when no one is watching. The most profound acts of love often happen in darkness, performed by people the world chooses to ignore. Judge Mateen discovered that justice isn't always found in legal precedent. Sometimes it's found in understanding the weight of sacrifice and the courage it takes to forgive. But here's what haunts me most about this story. How many other Rawiri Tepunas are walking amongst us right now? How many silent heroes are carrying burdens that aren't theirs, protecting secrets that slowly destroy them, choosing love over recognition every single day? The next time you see someone society has forgotten, truly see them. Remember that heroes don't always wear uniforms or carry medals. Sometimes they carry blankets with hand-stitched stars. This story lives because people like you choose to share it, to remember it, to let it change how you see the world. If Rawiri's sacrifice moved you, if Judge Mateen's journey toward understanding touched your heart, then give this story the gift it deserves: your voice. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and follow our channel, because every week we bring you stories that matter, stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Because in the end, the greatest tribute we can offer to people like Rawiri Tepuna isn't silence. It's ensuring their stories continue to inspire long after they're gone. What story will you choose to live?